The streets of Crestwood Heights were deceptively calm that morning, the kind of suburbia where every house looked like it had been lifted from a catalog. White picket fences gleamed in the weak sunlight, sprinklers hissed in manicured lawns, and a faint hum of distant lawnmowers and car engines filled the air. Yet, beneath that idyllic surface, a storm was brewing, one that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with a woman named Karen Whitmore. Karen had been the thorn in my side since the day we moved into this neighborhood. To the untrained eye, she was just another HOA queen bee, pearls around her neck, perfectly coiffed hair, a floral dress that seemed permanently ironed and pressed. Her house, a 2-story white-columned mansion, dominated the cul-de-sac, and the Mercedes in the driveway gleamed like a trophy. But behind that polished exterior lurked an obsession, control. And unfortunately, my mailbox had become her latest project. It started innocently enough, if one could call it that. Packages I'd ordered, letters addressed to Jenna or me, small things at first, went missing. I thought perhaps the post office had erred or that a neighbor had been careless. But patterns don't lie. Bills disappeared just before their due dates. Amazon packages vanished, sometimes before Jenna had even tracked them. And every time I tried to confront Karen or anyone at the HOA, her sugar-coated excuses and serene smile deflected suspicion like sunlight off a mirror. "Maybe I just saw it lying there and held it for safekeeping," she'd said once, her voice as smooth as cream, while I could feel my blood pressure spike. Her explanation was absurd, but it came with a glint in her eye that screamed, "I own this street, and you're just a guest." I tried diplomacy first. Notes slipped under her door, "Stop taking my mail. This is theft and federal law violation." The notes disappeared. I tried cameras. The first one was missing the next morning, screws stripped clean, a message in itself. I called the HOA, how I called them, explaining the theft with a precision that would make a detective proud. But Karen's presence there, smiling at me across the boardroom table, made it clear she had influence, allies, and cunning I hadn't yet accounted for. It all came to a head on a Wednesday. I had stepped outside to retrieve the morning mail, expecting another ordinary day. The crisp autumn air was tinged with the scent of cut grass and fallen leaves, and I half smiled at the thought of a normal routine finally. But nothing in Crestwood Heights was ever normal, not while Karen Whitmore prowled the cul-de-sac. There she was. At my mailbox. Leaning slightly, fingers rifling through my letters like a magician testing a deck of cards. She hadn't noticed me yet, lost in her self-appointed role as custodian of my mail. The sight ignited something in me, a mix of fury, disbelief, and a strange, electric thrill. "Karen," I said, my voice sharp, cutting through the quiet hum of the street. My pulse thudded in my ears, adrenaline surging. "What are you doing?" She turned slowly, her eyes widening just a fraction. The rest of her expression, the carefully practiced innocence, slid into place almost immediately. "Jonathan." "Oh, I was just checking the mailbox. You know, making sure everything was secure." Secure. The word dripped like poison in my veins. I clenched my fists, feeling the leather of my gloves bite against my palms, reminding me of the physical restraint I was imposing on myself. Rage rose like smoke, but I forced it down. This wasn't just about mail anymore, it was about respect, boundaries, and the principle that no one, no matter how smug or connected, had the right to steal from me. That night, I stared at the mailbox from my porch, lit only by the soft glow of the street lamp. The metal box sat innocuous and silent, but to me, it had transformed into a symbol, a battlefield, really. And I realized diplomacy had failed. Persuasion had failed. Even the law felt distant and impotent. If I wanted justice, if I wanted Karen Whitmore to learn her lesson, I would have to take matters into my own hands. I went into the garage and laid out my tools on the workbench. Wire cutters. Insulated gloves. A small car battery. Electrical tape. It wasn't complicated. It was precise. Controlled. Dangerous, in a way that would leave a lasting impression without causing real harm. My plan was simple: the mailbox would become a deterrent, a warning, a permanent reminder of boundaries. The thought of Karen reaching for my letters and receiving an electric reminder made my chest tighten with anticipation. I pictured her face, her eyes wide, lips parted in disbelief, a scream caught somewhere between outrage and shock. The house grew quiet around me, Jenna asleep upstairs, unaware of the storm brewing in our driveway. I worked with meticulous care, connecting wires, testing connections, ensuring the small spark would be enough to startle, but not enough to hurt. Every connection, every insulated clip, every careful placement of tape was deliberate. This wasn't just revenge, it was an art form. I remembered the first time I had confronted Karen in person, her smirk so infuriating, the way she had laughed at my polite but firm requests. That laugh, the sheer entitlement in her voice, echoed in my memory as I finished the last connections. It was a fuel, a spark that fed the calculated thrill of anticipation. By the time the final wire was clipped into place, the mailbox looked completely ordinary, yet beneath the surface, it had become a silent sentinel, ready to exact its lesson. I stepped back, gloves still on, and admired my work. The adrenaline had subsided slightly, replaced by a cold, determined satisfaction. This wasn't about petty theft anymore. It was about reclaiming control. I went to bed that night with visions of morning in my mind, Karen approaching the mailbox, her confident stride faltering, fingers brushing against the electrified metal, a scream echoing through the cul-de-sac. I imagined neighbors speaking through blinds, children pausing mid-game to gape at the spectacle, and the slow, inevitable realization settling over Karen Whitmore that she had finally met her match. As I drifted off, the quiet hum of suburbia outside my window felt different. The ordinary sounds of sprinklers, distant laughter, and cars on pavement took on a tense, cinematic quality, as if the street itself had become a stage and I, for once, was no longer the passive player. Tomorrow, the calm would shatter. And I, Jonathan Baker, would be ready. Morning broke over Crestwood Heights with a deceptive serenity, the kind of quiet that masks the brewing storm. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, the golden sunlight spilling across the asphalt like liquid warmth, and glanced at my mailbox. To the casual observer, it was nothing more than an ordinary black box, perched at the edge of the lawn. But I knew differently. Beneath its unassuming exterior, wires snaked and pulsed, a small car battery feeding a controlled current designed to deliver a shock. A warning. A lesson. A deterrent. I slipped on the leather gloves I'd meticulously cleaned the night before and gave the connections one final inspection. The insulated clips held firm. The wires were hidden neatly inside the mailbox frame, and the battery was secured beneath the post. I pressed a small test button, and a tiny spark jumped between two contacts, enough to startle without causing harm. It was perfect. Almost artistic in its precision. I stepped back and allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Today, the balance of power would shift. The sun rose higher, warming the cul-de-sac and casting long shadows across lawns and driveways. Children ran past, laughing, backpacks bouncing, oblivious to the silent war taking place at the end of the street. I, however, could not afford such innocence. Every car passing, every figure walking by, felt like a potential harbinger of chaos. And then I saw her. Karen Whitmore, in all her imperious glory, jogging past the row of houses, earbuds in, oblivious to the small but significant storm waiting for her. Her stride was confident, almost predatory, as if the street were her private stage. She paused by the mailbox 2 doors down, stretching with exaggerated precision, and I felt my pulse quicken. The moment was approaching. By mid-afternoon, she returned, climbing out of her polished silver Volvo like a queen returning to her throne. Her gaze swept over the cul-de-sac, and I noticed the careful, almost calculated way she moved, eyes darting, hands adjusting sunglasses, her floral dress swaying with a practiced grace. It was a performance, and my mailbox was the stage. She stopped in front of it, tilting her head, lips pursed in that habitual expression that seemed to say, "I own everything here." Slowly, deliberately, she opened the mailbox, her hand sliding toward my letters. And that's when it happened. Her scream ripped through the neighborhood like a sudden clap of thunder. She jerked backward, stumbling over the curb, clutching her hand as if it had been seared. The letters spilled onto the pavement, fluttering like oversized snowflakes caught in a gust of wind. Her face twisted in a mixture of shock, disbelief, and outrage, and I couldn't help but feel a thrill of vindication. I stepped onto the porch, pretending to tie my shoe, casual, unbothered. My gloves still clung to my hands, a subtle reminder of the meticulous preparation behind this minor but effective act of justice.
"Karen," I called, my voice smooth, almost taunting, "what's wrong?"
She spun toward me, eyes wide, face flushed with rage.
"Jonathan! What in the world have you done?"
I leaned against the railing, hands in pockets, and allowed a faint, carefully controlled smile.
"Oh, nothing.
Just making sure my mail stays where it belongs." Her screeching continued, and soon, neighbors had emerged from windows, lawn chairs, and driveways, drawn by the unmistakable sound of scandal and terror. Some whispered to one another, shielding children from the spectacle, while others, older couples with long memories of Karen's theatrics, exchanged knowing glances. The stage had an audience, and I was at the center. Karen's fury was palpable, her voice sharp, brittle, and trembling with rage.
"This is illegal. I'm calling the HOA. I'm calling the police. You can't do this."
I stepped forward, gloves still on, my tone calm, almost soothing.
"I'm sure you can call whoever you like.
But technically, you were trespassing.
I've taken precautions for safety."
My words were soft, but each syllable landed with precision, like pebbles dropped into a pond, rippling outward to settle over her ego. Her hands shook as she scooped up the scattered letters, muttering under her breath. I knew her paranoia was already setting in, the slow burn of suspicion and fear beginning to distort her daily routines. That was the quiet power of deterrence. It wasn't just the physical shock, it was the psychological one. Every time she thought of my mailbox, she would remember that moment. Her overconfidence met with a lesson she hadn't anticipated. The HOA erupted later that afternoon in a flurry of complaints, emails, and frantic calls. Karen framed it as an attack, a violation of every social and legal norm, but I was ready. My preparations had been meticulous.
The mailbox had a clear warning sign taped to the post, "Mailbox electrified. Trespassers will be shocked."
Any attempt to claim ignorance would crumble under scrutiny, and the HOA board, long weary of Karen's theatrics, had no interest in taking her side. It was satisfying to watch from the sidelines. The whispered conversations in the neighborhood shifted subtly. People glanced at my house with curiosity, some with admiration. The children whispered to each other about the electric mailbox, their imaginations inflating the story into legend. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the street, Karen Whitmore was learning that control was never absolute, no matter how polished the exterior. Even Jenna noticed the change.
She came home that evening, eyes wide and sparkling with a mix of disbelief and amusement.
"You did it," she said, half laughing, half incredulous.
"You actually did it."
I smirked, feeling a warmth that had little to do with the setting sun.
"Not just did it," I said. "We've set the terms. Mail stays mine."
But the victory wasn't just about letters and packages. It was about reclaiming dignity in a neighborhood where petty tyrants often ruled with smirks and rules. Every stolen envelope had been a battle, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance mattered most. And now, that tiny piece of metal, wired and silent, had shifted the balance. As night fell over Crestwood Heights, the streets emptying and the glow of porch lights flickering on, the mailbox sat unassuming yet potent at the edge of the lawn.
It was no longer just a receptacle for letters, it was a statement.
Every hum of the battery, every hidden wire, every carefully insulated clip whispered a silent warning to anyone who might consider overstepping boundaries. In the quiet of the evening, I reflected on the strange satisfaction of control regained. For months, I had been frustrated, helpless, and endlessly patient. Now, I was in a position where subtlety and precision had done what confrontation and pleading could not. Karen Whitmore had met a wall she could not climb.
And deep down, I realized something else. This wasn't only about revenge.
It was about strategy, patience, and the power of intellect applied with precision. In suburbia, where appearances mask ambition and malice, sometimes the quietest victories are the most powerful. I poured myself another cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen, and looked out the window at the mailbox.
The street lay in golden twilight, innocent and unaware of the battle lines drawn.
And for the first time in months, a sense of calm satisfaction settled over me.
Tomorrow, the repercussions would ripple further. Karen's paranoia would grow.
the neighbors would murmur. The street would adjust to a new order. And through it all, the mailbox would remain, silent, unwavering, and electrified, a sentinel at the edge of my lawn, a reminder that some lessons are best learned with a spark. And I, Jonathan Baker, would be ready for every consequence. The days that followed the infamous mailbox incident felt surreal. Crestwood Heights hummed along with its usual suburban rhythm: lawnmowers, sprinklers, the faint laughter of children, but beneath the quiet, the neighborhood had shifted.
Karen Whitmore's confidence had withered into something far more fragile.
Every glance toward my house, every subtle twitch of her hand when she passed my yard, betrayed a paranoia I had cultivated with precision. She had become a ghost of the tyrant she once was. Where once she strolled with the authority of a queen surveying her realm, now she tiptoed, eyes flicking nervously toward my mailbox, muttering under her breath about outrageous retaliation and criminal intent. It was intoxicating to watch from my porch, Jenna beside me, a cold autumn breeze carrying the scent of fallen leaves and gasoline from a distant mower. The mailbox had transformed into more than a deterrent, it had become a symbol. It wasn't just about the electricity hidden inside, it was the audacity of claiming what was yours and standing firm against someone who believed rules applied to everyone but herself. I often caught myself smiling when a neighbor would wave or nod knowingly, the unspoken acknowledgement of the quiet war waged in one. And yet, victory did not mean complacency. Karen Whitmore's ego had been bruised, but her obsession with control had not dissipated. The HOA meetings became subtle battlegrounds. She attempted to mobilize complaints, threats, and gossip, but the board, long weary of her theatrics, had little patience left. Each of her arguments was met with polite dismissal or quiet laughter behind her back, leaving her increasingly isolated.
One Friday evening, I was on the porch with Jenna, the golden hour light spilling across our lawn. We sipped coffee and watched the cul-de-sac settle into the soft rhythm of evening.
That's when I noticed a cluster of children approaching, a mix of curiosity and mischief in their step. They stopped near the mailbox, whispering excitedly.
"Did he really shock Karen?" one asked, eyes wide. I chuckled, shaking my head.
"Not just her," I said. "Sometimes, people just need to learn boundaries the hard way."
The children nodded solemnly, absorbing the lesson in their own innocent way.
I realized then that this little suburban drama had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just about stolen mail, it had become a story that would ripple through the neighborhood, a cautionary tale wrapped in a small spark of poetic justice. The weeks stretched on, each day a reinforcement of the order I had established.
Packages remained untouched. Letters arrived and were collected without incident.
Even Karen had grown cautious enough to avoid crossing the invisible boundary entirely. Her confidence, once so insufferable, had crumbled, leaving her a shell of her former self, resentful, wary, and endlessly calculating. Then came the moment that truly defined the aftermath. It was late afternoon when I noticed Karen lingering near the corner of the street, watching my mailbox from a distance. She flinched whenever a hand approached it, muttering curses under her breath. Her posture, once rigid with control, was now slouched, tentative, like a cat avoiding a puddle. I realized with a quiet satisfaction that the mailbox had become a psychological barrier far more powerful than its metal frame or hidden wires. I decided to take a measured approach. I didn't confront her. I didn't gloat. I simply observed. Every subtle twitch, every careful step, was a confirmation of the shift in power.
The satisfaction wasn't just about revenge, it was about restoration. For months, I had been undermined, frustrated, and ignored.
Now, I had reclaimed my space, my dignity, and my sense of safety, all without violence, all without legal entanglements. Even Jenna noticed the change. That evening, she leaned against my shoulder, her eyes following Karen's cautious retreat down the cul-de-sac. "You did it," she said softly, a mix of pride and disbelief in her voice.
"You didn't just get revenge. You fixed it."
I smiled, a low, quiet expression of contentment.
"It's not about revenge," I said. "It's about boundaries. People need to learn them the hard way sometimes."
Night fell, and the cul-de-sac emptied.
Porch lights flickered on one by one, casting pools of warmth across driveways.
The mailbox sat quietly, unassuming, a sentinel at the edge of the lawn. Beneath its simple black exterior lay a lesson in patience, intelligence, and strategic action, a reminder that even in a world dominated by petty tyrants and overzealous neighbors, careful planning could restore order. In the weeks that followed, Karen's attempts to regain control became almost comical. She tried to influence board meetings, rally support among neighbors, and even threaten legal action, but her words fell flat. The neighborhood, once captivated by her antics, had grown wary of her theatrics, leaving her isolated. And the mailbox remained silent, patient, unyielding. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore, it was a monument. A monument to cleverness over arrogance, planning over entitlement, and quiet power over bluster. I often found myself looking at it, running a hand over the post as if confirming the victory. The wires were hidden, the battery contained, but the message was clear: respect boundaries, or face the consequences. Even Karen could not ignore it. I watched her from the window one afternoon, peeking from behind the curtains of her pristine white-columned house, eyes darting to the mailbox, hands clenched tightly at her sides. There was anger, yes, but also fear. And beneath that fear, the slow, grudging acceptance that some battles could not be won by bluster or entitlement alone. The psychological impact was more satisfying than the physical deterrent. She adjusted her routines, avoiding my property entirely, muttering to herself about outrageous neighbors and crazy acts of aggression. I could almost hear the wheels turning in her mind, the endless calculations of power, all rendered moot by a quiet, invisible barrier. That night, as Jenna and I sat on the porch sipping tea, the sky deepening into a velvet blue, I reflected on the strange satisfaction of what we had accomplished. Months of frustration, anxiety, and stolen mail had been transformed into triumph, not through confrontation, but through ingenuity, patience, and the willingness to act decisively. Crestwood Heights, with its white fences and manicured lawns, had returned to its deceptive calm. But beneath the surface, the hierarchy had shifted. Karen Whitmore's reign of petty tyranny had ended, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement that some boundaries were absolute and that crossing them had consequences. And I, Jonathan Baker, had learned something profound about the nature of power in suburban warfare. Sometimes, diplomacy fails. Sometimes, rules are ignored. Sometimes, the only solution is subtle but firm action, calculated and precise, leaving a lasting impression that words alone could never convey. The mailbox, quiet and unassuming, embodied that lesson. It stood at the edge of the lawn, a sentinel of justice and intellect, a monument to the idea that boundaries, once set and enforced, could command respect even from the most arrogant of neighbors. Jenna leaned against me, her voice a gentle nudge against the quiet night. "So, ready for round 2 with the HOA?" she teased, a spark of mischief in her eyes. I chuckled, taking a slow sip of tea and letting the moment sink in. "Not today," I said. "But I'm ready, if they are." And for the first time in months, I believed it. Crestwood Heights could have its rules. Karen Whitmore could have her ambitions. But I had something more enduring: dignity, strategy, and a mailbox that would never, ever lie to me again. The night settled over the neighborhood like a soft blanket. The leaves whispered in the wind. The street was quiet, obedient even, as if acknowledging the invisible lines drawn by careful hands. And I smiled, knowing that in this small corner of suburbia, justice, quiet, clever, unyielding justice, had been delivered. The war was over, at least for now. And I, standing beside the woman I loved, watched the stars emerge over Crestwood Heights, content in the knowledge that some lessons, once taught, endure forever.